They finished the barrier while I was away. 8 feet high, solid steel sheets still, radiating heat from fresh welds, anchored deep into the gravel like they'd always belonged there. $8,000 worth of galvanized certainty, ceiling, off the only driveway leading into my ranch. I stayed seated in my truck for a moment, engine humming, dust floating in, the sunlight trying to wrap my head around how a man could leave his own land in the morning and return to find it locked against him. That's when I noticed her on the opposite side of the fence, wearing white heels that had no place anywhere near loose gravel. A clipboard was tucked under her arm like an official insignia. She was smiling, the kind of smile people rehearse alone in front of mirrors. "Mr. Hale," she said, tapping her pen as if adding punctuation. "Your livestock does not align with our community standards." Her name was Marjorie Langford, president of the Silverbrook Ridge HOA. And in that instant, she looked less like a neighbor and more like someone surveying newly claimed ground. "This gate will remain locked," she went on, voice steady, well practiced, "until every animal is removed." I remember how still the air felt. No birds, no breeze, just a faint, metallic whine of cooling steel and the lingering diesel scent left behind by contractors who were already long gone. My ranch had stood here for 6 decades. My grandfather drove the first fence, post by hand, when this valley was nothing but scrub, cattle, and people who understood that if you couldn't stand the smell of manure, you didn't move next to a ranch. My name is Ethan Cole, third generation cattle rancher in Red Hollow Valley, Montana. 49 years old, hands split and scarred from barbed wire and frozen dawns, still reaching for my wife's coffee mug every morning, even though she'd been gone a year and a half. Cancer doesn't make announcements. It just steals things quietly, one habit at a time. This land was what kept me standing after that. The scent of hay, the snap of tightened fence wire, the routine of feeding cattle at sunrise before the world decide how cruel it plans to be. And now it was cordoned off like a crime scene. Silverbrook Ridge appeared about 12 years ago. 200 luxury houses, rising where alfalfa once grew, sold as rural living with modern comfort, which really means they wanted the scenery, not the labor. They had a single entrance, one road. That road ran past a small 2-acre parcel that once belonged to an old farmer named Walter Briner, a man who understood leverage long before anyone started using the word. What Marjorie Langford never stopped to ask herself was why development that expensive had only one way in or out. She'd been targeting me since my wife's funeral. Noise complaints about roosters crowing, health complaints about farm smells, environmental alarms about cattle near a creek that had watered livestock since Eisenhower was president. It was never about safety. It was about value. Marjorie owned 4 rental homes inside Silverbrook Ridge, all mortgaged, all dependent on climbing prices. And nothing kills a glossy brochure faster than a widowed rancher in muddy boots managing 200 head of cattle. She wanted the land. She wanted me out. And while she was busy turning HOA bylaws into weapons like a social club gone paramilitary, I was working quietly. I was studying property deeds, easements, old agreements written back when neighbors were expected to settle issues without a committee vote. 6 months earlier, Walter Briner decided to sell his small parcel, too old to maintain it. His kids were out of state, worn down by developers calling every week pretending to be interested buyers. Marjorie tried to acquire it through a shell company. I matched her offer, added enough cash to make Walter grin, and sign documents thicker than a phone book. Buried inside was a single line so perfect it read like poetry, exclusive authority over vehicular access gate operations for the Silverbrook Ridge subdivision. She built a wall to cage me in. She never realized I already owned the key to her front door. The pressure ramped up fast. Security. Guard began pacing my fence line, boots, crunching on gravel like they were, protecting a missile silo instead of a pasture. Social media flooded with pictures of my cattle drinking from the creek, captions written like emergency alerts. The local news aired a segment called Ranch Operations Raise Health. Concerns for Suburban Families, complete, with Marjorie standing stiffly in front of my fence. Concern turned up to full volume. We're not anti-agriculture, she said, eyes fixed on the camera, but public safety must come first. The funny thing about people who say that is they never mean everyone's safety. They mean their own. Then came the fines. Grass too high, equipment unsightly, vehicles improperly parked on my own driveway. 47 violations in 2 weeks each. One $500 a day, piling up like poker chips meant to force me to fold. Underneath it all was fear. Fear that if I stayed, the land would never flip, prices would stall, and her tidy investment empire would shake. And fear makes people careless. While she filed complaints, she was also leaving a paper trail of dependence. Every letter, every emergency motion, every demand for access, control, quietly proved that Silverbrook Ridge couldn't operate without cooperation from land that had existed decades before it. She didn't notice. She was too busy playing monarch of a kingdom built on a single road. When I finally spoke to her again, she didn't even pretend this was about coexistence. You're outdated, she said flatly, clipboard pressed tight to her chest. This valley is changing. I looked at the steel wall, the cameras, the guards, pretending not to listen. So am I told her. And that's when she smiled. The kind of smile people wear right before they make a decision that ends up costing them everything. Okay, pause the movie for a moment, because this is where stories like this usually get twisted. Under standard practice, most HOAs operate on one core assumption: homeowners are too busy, too exhausted, or too intimidated to actually read the documents that control land use. Bylaws are enforced loudly, fines are issued aggressively, and people comply because fighting back costs time, money, and peace of mind. From a legal standpoint, that's where Marjorie Langford committed her first fatal mistake. HOA rules don't exist in isolation. They sit beneath county records, beneath recorded easements, and far beneath agreements filed decades earlier that were never terminated. An easement recorded in the 1960s doesn't care how polished the neighborhood looks now or how high the home prices climbed. If it was written correctly, it still controls access. And this is the mental trap HOA power players fall into again and again. It's psychological because authority starts to feel like ownership. Enforce rules long enough and people begin to believe they are the system itself. That clipboard turns into a scepter. Enforcement becomes identity, and dissent feels like a personal attack instead of a legal disagreement. So when Marjorie escalated security patrols, media pressure, environmental claims, she wasn't just trying to eliminate a ranch. She was trying to assert dominance, to prove resistance was pointless. The irony is that every escalation generated evidence, every complaint proved dependency, every emergency filing admitted that Silverbrook Ridge couldn't function on its own. Every accusation reinforced that the ranch existed first and still mattered. The lesson here is simple but uncomfortable. Power isn't about who shouts the loudest or moves the fastest. It's about who understands the hierarchy of control and stays calm long enough to let the other side reveal their own weakness. And Marjorie was about to reveal hers in spectacular fashion. By the third month, Marjorie stopped, pretending this was about compliance. That's when the contractor appeared, behind the subdivision. Heavy machines, chewing into the ground like they had something to prove. Diesel fumes settled over the valley, mixing with that damp, metallic scent you only get when soil that's been untouched for decades is suddenly torn open. At first, they called it drainage improvements. That story lasted about 5 minutes. My boarder, colleague Dusty, stood at the fence barking, as if the machines had personally insulted him. Honestly, I agreed. Trenches were being cut straight through. A protected land area, the kind that shows up on federal maps in red ink with footnotes that say, "Don't even try it." One of the security guards, a young guy, decent, still believed rules meant something, wandered over during his break. "Mr. Cole," he said quietly, eyes flicking back toward the equipment. "That's not drainage. That's road prep." That was the moment it clicked. Marjorie wasn't just harassing me anymore. She was panicking. She'd finally realized the subdivision had a weakness, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. And panic makes ambitious people reckless. She was trying to carve out a back door without asking permission from anyone who actually mattered. Environmental law doesn't care how expensive your lawyer is. One anonymous call later, inspectors arrived with clipboards heavier than Marjorie's ego. 2 hours after that, the machines were shut down, orange tape snapping in the wind like a warning. Banner. Fines followed. Serious ones, the kind printed on federal letterhead with zero sense of humor. That should have slowed her. Instead, she went nuclear. Property liens, emergency motions, claims that my ranch was a public nuisance that required immediate shutdown. Private investigators suddenly took an interest in my routines, my finances, even my mail. One of them crossed a line dumb, enough to bring federal attention down fast. And through all of it, Marjorie was recording everything, meetings, phone calls, strategy sessions she believed would one day prove her righteousness. She didn't realize she was assembling a library of confessions. Thursday night was supposed to be her victory lap. An emergency HOA meeting scheduled for 7 p.m., timed perfectly so working. Families would still be stuck in traffic, leaving the room filled with her allies and investors. The agenda read like a power grab disguised as concern, imminent, domain pressure, legal authorization for final enforcement actions, language vague, enough to scare and specific enough to destroy. She planned to finish me. What she didn't plan for was traffic. At 6:30 p.m. sharp, I stepped onto the 2-acre parcel I'd quietly purchased months earlier, the one Silverberg Ridge. Drove past every single day without noticing. The underground access chamber was still there, hidden beneath a plain concrete lid, unmarked and unimpressive. Inside sat the original manual override system installed in 1962. Simple, mechanical, immune to software updates. And arrogance, the brass key Walter Briner handed me felt warm in my hand. I turned it clockwise. That was all. No alarms, no theatrics. The electronic gate simply stopped responding. The first car reached the entrance 4 minutes later. Then another, then 10 more. By 6:45, the road was clogged with luxury SUVs, sedans, minivans packed with kids and groceries. People stepped out holding phones, mashing remotes like repetition. Might fix a problem they didn't understand yet. Confusion turned into frustration. Frustration hardened into anger. By 7 p.m., nearly half the subdivision was locked out of its own neighborhood inside the clubhouse. Marjorie called the meeting to order, unaware her audience was missing. Not because they didn't care, but because they physically couldn't get inside. That's when county officials showed up, then the traffic engineer, then quietly federal agents. At 7:15, I walked up to the gate, deed in one hand, brass key in the other, the sound of idling engines, hanging in the air like a low, steady snarl. "You can't do this," someone shouted. Actually, I could, and according to the documents, I'd been able to the entire time. I explained it calmly. No, Ray's voice, no victory speech. This land controlled the gate. It always had. The subdivision existed because my predecessors allowed it to exist. The same agreement that made Silverbrook Ridge possible also made it dependent. The engineer confirmed it. And that's when people started to understand, not just the gate, but the power structure they had never questioned. At 7:20, I turned the key back. The gate opened. Cars rolled through as if nothing had happened, except everything had. Inside the clubhouse, Marjorie was mid-sentence. When federal agents walked in, she objected loudly, accused everyone of collusion, of rural sabotage, of being targeted. None of it mattered. They had recordings, messages, financial trails, environmental violations, mail, tampering, bribery. The walls she'd built, legal, social, psychological, came down all at once as she was let out in. Handcuffs past the same gate, she thought. She controlled. The room stayed quiet. No applause, no cheers, just clarity. 6 months later, the steel wall blocking. My ranch was gone, replaced by a simple wooden fence that marked the boundary. Without declaring war, Silverbrook Ridge elected a new board. The fines vanished. The liens disappeared. The lawsuits evaporated. The subdivision didn't fall apart like Marjorie warned it would. It stabilized. Property values climbed. Tension eased. Neighbors started waving again, and the ranch stayed. Not because I forced it to, but because I understood exactly what I controlled and when to use it. Here's the part no one tells you. When stories like this end, the win doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels quiet, almost anticlimactic, because by the time the dust settles, you realize the real fight was never about fences or cows or HOAs. It was about something far more uncomfortable: control. Marjorie Langford didn't lose because she was outplayed in one clever moment. She lost because she confused authority with power, volume with leverage, and paperwork with ownership. She assumed that if she escalated fast enough and loudly enough, I'd fold, sell, leave, disappear, like so many people do when faced with institutional pressure. And that assumption is incredibly common, according to standard design systems. Like HOAs are built to wear people down, not defeat them outright. The fines don't have to be fair. They just have to be constant. The rules don't have to make sense. They just have to be enforced aggressively. Most people don't lose because they're wrong. They lose because they're exhausted. From a legal standpoint, this is why understanding hierarchy matters more than memorizing. Rules, bylaws sit beneath county records. County records sit beneath state law. And long-standing easements, especially the ones no one bothers to read, sit like landmines under modern developments that assume the past is irrelevant. It isn't. And this is a psychological trap all of us need to recognize. People who crave control tend to overplay their hand. They document everything. They talk too much. They escalate instead of pausing. They believe pressure equals dominance. But pressure also leaves fingerprints. The harder Marjorie pushed, the more she proved dependence. The more she tried to erase the ranch, the more she legally anchored it as essential. Every complaint became evidence. Every emergency motion became an admission of reliance. The lesson here isn't revenge. The lesson is restraint. I could have shut that gate permanently, legally, completely. The Subdivision would have collapsed under. Insurance failures, emergency access, violations, and crashing property. Values. 200 families would have paid the price for one woman's obsession. With control, that kind of power exists. But using it would have made me the same thing I was fighting. So instead, I used education. 30 minutes of inconvenience accomplished more than 3 months of arguments. One clear demonstration exposed a truth no one wanted to admit. That comfort is often borrowed, not owned, and communities only work when respect moves both ways. Here's the bigger takeaway, and it goes far beyond HOAs. If someone is trying to push you out, silence you, overwhelm you, ask yourself one question before you react. What do I actually control? Here, not what you wish you controlled, not what they insist you don't, what you legally, structurally, quietly control. Because real power rarely announces itself. It doesn't come with clipboards, press releases, or emergency meetings. It lives in contracts nobody reads, systems nobody questions, and patience most people don't have. Marjorie thought power meant walls. I learned it means gates, and gates work both ways. So I'll leave you with this, and I really do want to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if someone tried to force you out of what was rightfully yours? Would you fight loud, or would you fight smart? Because sometimes the strongest move isn't breaking the system. It's understanding it better than the person trying to use it against you. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can hold is the key